Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. My name is Brandon, and I now reside in the great state of Alabama. This narrative took place in either 2008 or 2009 when I was around 14 years old. It's hard for me to recall exactly how old I was. For reasons that I'm not going to go into detail about here, at the time, my grandma and grandpa were my living arrangements. As a result, we were starting to move, and in the meanwhile, we were doing various tasks around the yard, including laying grass around the home. We had a few people assisting my grandpa and grandmother while my brother and I went about in the street and to run the home because while it was not a very huge house, it was big enough for us to have a deck on it. During this time, we had a few people helping my grandfather and grandmother. And on the back of it, there is a tiny wooded area that is just behind the home. So my brother and I were just playing, and I don't know why, but I had the feeling that something was strange about the trees behind us, like someone was there monitoring us and keeping an eye on us. I would sometimes hear the noises of branches and leaves moving. Perhaps it was due to the wind. Perhaps not, but perhaps 40 to 50 minutes later, we started to feel rather hungry and thirsty. After that, we returned to our games after we had some food. After we had finished eating and cleaning up, we went straight to playing, and 10 minutes had already gone. As soon as I did, the noises that I had been hearing disappeared, and I completely forgot about the woods. I came to a halt and took a quick glance in that direction before making my way over there to investigate more. Not really near, but close enough, and still nothing. It's as if whatever was in there simply stopped. Because I am easily nervous, I didn't want to think about it anymore, so I left and didn't walk back over behind the house. The following day, there was hardly any grass left to hide the home, and the sun was about to set, but I failed to recall that I should stay away from the rear of the house until it was absolutely essential. While I was performing, I strolled behind the scene and stood there. I received the impression that I wasn't alone and that there was another entity in the room with me. I looked to my right and saw what seemed to be a large animal, either a werewolf or some type of upright dog, with yellow eyes staring at me as I was lying on the ground. I only stopped moving for a few seconds before running to the front of the house to inform my grandparents about what I had just seen. However, none of them believed what I said and encouraged me to continue playing. Therefore, for the remainder of the time, I did nothing but sit at the front of the home under the impression that this was the case. I am no closer to understanding what it was or even whether it was ever there. Even before I moved there, I was certain that I heard things outdoors in the woods, and on occasion, I even saw things there. Around that time, 2010, things began to really get going for them. See, my closest buddy lives on the edge of a little local village, which is just about 10 miles away if you take the crow's eye view of things. There is a significant amount of dense undergrowth and forestation. It is almost entirely private land, and the closest neighbor is around a quarter mile away in both directions. The area is quite remote. One evening, the girlfriend of my closest buddy had just stepped outside after spending the evening at his home with him. When they were enjoying a picnic together outdoors in his front yard, he chucked an apple out there. He had taken a bite out of it, tasted that it was too sour for him, and then flung it. The next morning, he was outside his house doing some cleaning when he decided to look for the apple that he had left behind by mistake and discovered that it was gone. He didn't give it a great deal of consideration at all. He had just assumed that some animal had snatched it and disappeared with it. In the end, there was just one apple involved. He had a habit of leaving food out for deer and other creatures that lived far away from his home, so he tossed it away with the assumption that they would find it and consume it anyhow. After being gone for almost a week, when he returned home from work, he discovered a dead fox on his front doorstep. It seemed as if it had been killed by being suffocated. It seemed as if its eyes were about to burst out of its head. He said that the murder was recent, but he was unsure if someone was simply attempting to screw with him or what the real reason was. After that, he glanced over at the fox, and he saw the same thing. Now that a rotting apple with a bite taken out of it was sitting right next to the dead fox, he began to freak out and was plenty sure that somebody was messing with his head. He was sure that somebody was messing with his head. Despite this, he did not call anybody. He decided to refrain from acting and instead patiently wait to see if anything else would take place. Time passed, yet nothing else took place throughout that time. The occurrences that I have just described to you took place in September, before the weather became noticeably colder. And so, skip ahead approximately 6 to 9 months to the subsequent spring, just as the weather was starting to get warmer again. One evening, he was hosting his girlfriend for dinner at his house when all of a sudden, his girlfriend began yelling that there was a huge man covered in hair standing in the front yard. He took off and opened his door as soon as he landed. They were standing approximately 50 feet away from the large black mass that was in the front yard. Exactly how he had described it. His eyes tried to focus in on it and the twilight of the evening, but his eyes pulled him to the object that this thing seemed to be holding in its hand. It was just standing there. His eyes tried to focus in on it. It appeared to be a raccoon that had died, and it was a sizable one at that. He was unable to make out a face, features that were definitive, or anything else that would be specific to its description. However, he reported that he had the impression that it was looking directly at him. This thing swiftly disappeared into the cover of a nearby tree. After it became aware that he was looking at it, he reported that the creature appeared to be between 5 and 6 feet in height. If he had to guess, it most likely had a very stocky build and a shaggy, hairy appearance. Over the course of the next few days, he had an unshakable conviction that the creature he had spotted outside of his home was in fact a Sasquatch. After giving it more thought, he came to the conclusion that the creature in question was the one that had abandoned the dead fox and the apple that had been partially eaten on his front porch the previous autumn. He came to this conclusion after thinking more and more about the incident. He hasn't experienced any other activity around his house or anything like that since initially sighting this in his front yard. To begin, I'd like to share with you a few brief experiences that I've had. It all started when I was probably around 12 years old. I'm 19 now. My sister Zoe, father's stepmother at the time, and her 2 daughters Jade, who was my age, and Maddie, who's my sister's age, were camping. We had only been there for a day at that point, but everything worked out just fine. Following that, my sisters and I came to the conclusion that we would visit the stream on our own. My grandfather provided each of us with a walkie-talkie so that we could stay in touch with one another while we were away. Now the place we were going to was surrounded by bush, and to get there you had to go down a little path through it. We took our shoes off and played around in the water for a while during our break. When Jade mentioned that she could make out something standing in the middle of the trees, when we all looked, there was a figure there. It was dark, but you could make out the outline of a human being, even though you couldn't make out the face. After a brief period of observation, it vanished before our very eyes. We didn't give it much thought and continued to have fun in the water, but I started to feel uneasy after some time had passed, and when we all turned around to see if he was still there, we saw that he was. There was complete and utter silence. I was only just barely able to make out the sound of the rapids in the small stream. We stopped looking. After about 20 minutes, we made our way back to the campground, and by the time we arrived, the forest and the other sounds that had been surrounding us were completely silent. Although I was about 20 meters ahead of them and they were lagging behind, we were unable to see each other because of the distance between us. I turned around after hearing a twig break behind me, and my first thought was that the other person had finally caught up to me. Actually, I turned around and saw the tall, dark-skinned figure that was only a foot or so behind me. Therefore, I decided to keep running the entire time. I could sense its proximity to me from behind. I pushed myself to run as quickly as I could until I emerged into the open space of the campground. It had been removed. My sisters came out not long after I did, and I told them what had happened, but none of them had seen it behind me because they were too far behind me. I asked them, but none of them had seen it behind me because they were too far behind me. Anyway, the trail was winding, so throughout most of our camping trip, they were around a corner from me. This happened quite frequently. We didn't see it around as much, but every once in a while, there would be this figure that would just be standing there watching us. Fast forward a couple of years, and we go back there with my father's new girlfriend and her daughter Stella. Although I don't quite remember as much about this trip as Stella did, I do know for a fact that she went on it.